WNYC Studios is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone, and happy June. If you're happy when it's summer, happy June 1st. Some recent lines and episode titles from the New Yorker's Political Scene podcast go a long way to describe the moment the United States is in right now, I think. Susan Glasser and Evan Osnos are two of the co-hosts of that podcast, and they'll both join me in a minute. They're also going to do one of these live at the 92nd Street Y this week. We'll tell you about that. But some of those episode titles: Have Billionaires Gone Too Far? Corruption toppled Viktor Orban. Could Donald Trump be next? And The Art of No Deal, Trump's approach to the Iran war. And these episode titles dovetail with actual news headlines from the last few days. Did you stay with the news late enough into Friday to see that courts, at least for now, struck down both Trump's anti-weaponization fund, which many see as corrupt, and ordered the Kennedy Center not to rename itself after Trump. We will see if the courts weigh in on Trump creating a new $250 bill with guess whose face on it. But these New Yorker political writers also know that none of this guarantees Democrats victory in the midterms and that they have their own branding problems. Here, for example, from Morning Edition today is a clip of Democratic U.S. Senate candidate Graham Plattner, even as he fends off a focus on his past behavior, which has been in the news, saying the Dems have to get more real about how they bring it to these midterm campaigns.
Everybody knows that this system is built to screw working people. And what we need in this country is a clear political message about who is to blame. Because it isn't immigrants, it's not trans kids, it's billionaires, it's corporations.
Which brings us back to billionaires and corruption. Graham Plattner, as excerpted on Morning Edition. Evan Osnos, besides being a New Yorker staff writer, published the book last year called The Haves and Have-Yachts, Dispatches on the Ultrarich. Susan Glasser, besides being a New Yorker staff writer, is co-author of books including The Divider, the best-selling history of Donald Trump in the White House, which she co-wrote with her husband, Peter Baker, from the New York Times. Susan and Evan, we're glad you could join us to kick off the month of June. Welcome back, both of you, to WNYC.
Thanks, Brian.
So great to be with you.
Evan, you heard the Graham Plattner clip. You wrote the book, Dispatches from the Ultrarich, from your podcast called Have Billionaires Gone Too Far? Can you give us an example or two of too far how that people are at least raising questions about, and how you see that becoming an issue in the midterms for either party?
Well, it's very interesting because historically, Brian, Americans have been, generally speaking, kind of ambivalent about inequality and about giant fortune. On the one hand, a lot of people say, I don't know if it makes this country any fairer to have giant fortunes, but on the other hand, I might want to assemble one myself. This has kind of been our American condition for a long time, and what you're seeing in the last few years is that the mood is shifting very distinctly in some ways. There's a lot more suspicion than there was 10 or 20 years ago around the idea that that fortunes that are, in fact, statistically now larger than even at the height of the Gilded Age, when you had the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies, that those are an object of inspiration, but are in fact, for many people, at a time of rising inflation, of growing challenges, getting your first job out of college, that these are actually frustrating symbols. And you're hearing that show up in the politics. What's very interesting, listening to somebody like Graham Plattner of Maine this morning, is that he's talking about a rigged system, talking about frustrations, the idea that there is an elite that you can't get into, and to make a point that I think is probably creeping up in the minds of listeners right now. This is language we've been hearing for 10 years in American politics, including on the right. So it has now reached a point where this idea of a growing frustration is really becoming the centerpiece of our politics in 2026 and looking forward a couple of years down the line.
So, Susan, to Graham Plattner's framing, do you see that as more of an outlier or insurgent kind of Democratic theme? He's got that reputation to some degree as he runs for the Senate against Susan Collins in Maine. Or is it becoming mainstream for Democrats this year to be running on who to blame? He said very explicitly in that clip, we want to talk about who to blame for the problems in their lives, billionaires and corporations, not immigrants or trans kids, as he put it.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a spectrum, right, in both parties. And I do think this year we are seeing sort of the rise of a number of populist candidates on the left sort of litigating how far is that going to go. I absolutely agree with Evan there. This is a backlash election in the way that many midterm elections are, right? This is why the party in power has consistently over the last 2 decades lost seats and lost ground in the midterm election after a presidential election. This is a time where primarily voters are being asked to sort of render initial judgment on the presidency. And so I think Donald Trump is practically fueling a populist movement of his own on the left in many ways. It's as if he's teeing up arguments like Graham Plattner's, the idea that you're going to create a disruptive war in the Middle East and send oil prices spiking in the middle of a midterm election year in which your party was already favored to lose seats. Again, practically teeing it up. The idea that Donald Trump is sort of handed over whole swaths of his administration and policy making to billionaires who purchase access to him. That indelible visual of Trump's inauguration, where many of the billionaires were seated in front of the elected officials in the country. So I think it's that visceral rage and feeling that the country is going on the wrong track, which fuels this backlash election. But it's specifically a populist moment. The trillionaires versus everybody else, that's powerful stuff in American politics. There's a right-wing version and there's a left-wing version.
Yeah. And Evan, your initial answer kind of anticipated a follow-up question that I was going to ask anyway, which is in a historical context. And so the question is, do you see a political risk or complexity, despite what you laid out before, despite with what Susan was just saying, with running on grievance against billionaires, and now I guess there are trillionaires, like many voters of regular income historically may have thought, I don't care if some people get rich. Good that we have the opportunity to be that successful in our country. That's not why I'm struggling. In fact, maybe I'll be rich someday if the Democrats or the socialists don't flatten economic growth out so much with their class warfare. Or maybe that tension, as I think you were suggesting, might be a relic of the Reagan and Bush eras that doesn't apply anymore. Any impression?
I think you're onto something very important, Brian, which is that there is a genuine debate going on within the Democratic Party world, about whether Americans are, in fact, particularly whether Democratic voters are, in fact, inclined towards a sharper break with history. As you said, people have generally said, look, maybe I want to become one of these billionaires or trillionaires myself. I think that what we're seeing now, particularly among younger voters, is a realization of what the data suggests, which is that if you were born in 1940 in the United States, you ran a 90% chance of out-earning your parents. Today, that chance is less than half of what it was. And so when you hear booing, for instance, at commencements when the subject of AI comes up, AI in itself has become a kind of proxy conversation about the future of wealth and fairness in this country. Now, look, there are a lot of people who say it shouldn't be, keep it separate, let's have a technical conversation, let's think about the opportunities created by this new technology. But, one of the things we've learned about politics over the last few years is you can't tell voters to feel a certain way. You can't jawbone them into feeling more satisfied. And there's a lot of dissatisfaction and anxiety out there, and people like Graham Plattner are picking up on that. But it is a genuinely live debate about whether Democrats feel that they're going to do better in 2026 by tacking towards the middle, by saying, look, we hear you, but this is a very close fought. This is a country in which we have, strongly held views in high numbers on both sides, or whether they go further towards Bernie Sanders and AOC. And I don't think we know the answer yet. That's one of the core questions that we're going to be hashing out over the course of the next few months.
Listeners who has a question, a comment, or a story for New Yorker staff writers and political scene podcast hosts Susan Glasser and Evan Osnos, 212-433 WNYC. Call or text 212-433-9692. How much do you blame billionaires or corporations for the stresses on the American dream these days, or anything else as it affects you? How much do you think anything you consider Trump administration corruption, which we'll get to, or self-aggrandizing king posturing or authoritarian tendencies affects your own fates or fortunes? Or if you're a Democrat, does running against Trump, as opposed to what your party can offer, risk making a mistake from campaigns past? Yet again, some Democratic consultants see it that way. Or whatever else you want to say or ask that might be relevant to Susan and Evan's politics coverage in the New Yorker, 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. And let's go right to a call, because I think Peter in Huntington told our screener, if we talk about millionaires and billionaires in one breath, well, maybe we're seeing millionaires now complain about billionaires. Peter, did I get that right? You're on WNYC. Hi.
Hi, Brian. You nailed it. That's really my question, is that I've got the Bernie Sanders of the world, who are ostensibly a millionaire, complaining about the billionaires and no kings, and then we use the term fair share. Now, please define fair share. The upper 1%, we know federally carries 40% of the country. The upper 10% carries 80%. The bottom 50% pay nothing. So I think as a media, we feed into this with this information that, it's the billionaires. If the government stopped spending the way they spend and your taxes were reduced, everybody benefits. But on the upper end, I don't know if anybody's ever gotten a good paying job from somebody that pays no taxes. So it's please define fair share.
Thank you for your call. I appreciate it. And Susan, among other things, that call goes to the question of some Democrats who themselves are rich. I don't know if Bernie Sanders is a millionaire or not, maybe by total life savings, but you see what that attack is. So what were you thinking listening to that call?
Yeah, no, that's exactly, and historically that's how Republicans have sort of leveraged, as Evan said, this idea of the American dream, and is very compelling, and it's why a certain amount of bashing the rich has not succeeded in American politics when you might think it is. But right now, it's the accelerating inequality. There's a huge difference now, a bigger difference now between the 1% even and the 0.0001%. And when people see, as a result of those leaked IRS documents, that Donald Trump at one point I think his presidency paid, a couple $100 in taxes for the entire year, a billionaire. When Jeff Bezos, whose returns were also leaked for 1 year, paid almost nothing in taxes. I think that fuels this visceral sense of not just inequality, but accelerating inequality. And remember, in American politics, it's been so long in general that the American people have felt the country is on the wrong track. Well, you have to go back to the early George W. Bush era to find a time when a majority of Americans, according to surveys, felt that the country was on the right track. And of course, different in our polarized political era, if you're in a different political party, you define the problems differently. But the new normal is incredible, intense, and accelerating dissatisfaction with our politics. And I think, there's a different variant of it from the right, the center, and the left, but the commonality is a kind of metastasizing rage that the inequality accelerating is only making worse and worse. And I think it's hardening our political divisions rather than finding ways forward through them.
And Evan, to the caller's argument against the tax the rich politics, he even brought up the fact that, I think it's roughly accurate, that the bottom 50% of earners don't pay anything in federal income tax. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it reminds me of the biggest, probably the thing that hurt Mitt Romney the most way back in 2012 when he was running for president against Barack Obama, because he got caught on tape, or he just said it in a speech, something about 47% of the American public are tax recipients, not taxpayers. Like that was the problem. Instead of concentration of wealth. And of course, he could be considered an oligarch himself, probably, right?
Well, that's
with his personal wealth. But here we are again. Is that what Republicans really want to run on with, advice from Peter in Huntington?
It's becoming a harder and harder lift, let's be blunt about it politically, when you've got the President of the United States, who is, in his own way, kind of valorizing the idea with the people around him who, if you look at the patterns of pardons, for instance, that have been coming out of this administration that are, in many cases, going to people who are wealthy donors. You've also got the ballroom occupying a lot of political headlines. Remember what this conversation is about. It's about how people fundamentally are feeling about whether the people in power in this country hear them, listen to them, and are reflecting their concerns. And I think that, Peter, the caller in Huntington, makes the point that there may be a traditional reservoir of aspiration that people are saying, look, I want to get there too. But the reality is, you have to listen to what people are saying day to day, which is that they don't feel as if it is in their grasp. In fact, it feels like it's slipping out of their grasp. And so if you want to be politically strategic, if you want to be smart, you have to meet them where you are. You can't go ahead and say, I'm going to try to talk you into feeling better about your condition.
Yeah. But when he raises the tax the rich tension in terms of creating jobs, this is a question we may ask Mayor Mamdani tomorrow when we do our first Ask the Mayor episode with him for his administration, because that's the argument that we hear so much just locally in New York City against taxing the rich beyond a certain point and corporations, because then they're going to grow jobs elsewhere instead of here. So that political argument, at very least, whether or not it reflects the real economics, is still very much in play. I think kind of on another track from Peter in Huntington is Mariella in Queens. Mariella, you're on WNYC with Susan Glasser and Evan Osnos from The New Yorker. Thanks for calling in.
Oh, hi. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we got you.
Oh, great. Long time, first time. So this conversation really, it reminded me of a conversation I was having with my husband, where I was telling him, it really does not feel like you could just work hard and then, become wealthy, or like this American dream that used to exist where you just worked hard and you became wealthy. Now it's like this obscene wealth that you're never going to become. You're never going to become the Jeff Bezos. And so this idea that some, people are saying let's, the Democrats, or whoever's in power that's trying to make rich people less rich by taxing them too much. Maybe I'll be rich one day, and I don't know how many people are actually thinking that, because I don't think anyone thinks that it is within reach, that they're going to become the Jeff Bezos. And because it's not just that they're hard workers, Jeff Bezos isn't just a hard worker. It's like they have all this weird passive income that, things that you can't just work hard to get. Like they have a million houses, it's like a reality that does not exist for very little. It's for that less than 1% people. And I think people don't think they're going to reach that.
Mariella, thank you very much. Please don't make this your last time call after making a first time call. I'm going to go right to Tony in Queens, who's got yet another take. Tony, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Thank you, Brian. One of the things I loved was how you described what this is grievance. That's the truth of this. I got to be clear here. This is liberal grievance versus conservative grievance. And the thing about grievance is it's not based on numbers. It's based on faith. Look, we all know that Trump promised them coal and gave them and delivered ashes, right? but there was a reservoir of faith that he could draw from, the religious right, the Tea Party as it was. When you argue grievance, and let's be clear, this is grievance against billionaires, you have to have a reservoir of faith that you can draw from, a group that's there that you don't build based upon just the current grievance that you're using, but a group that's ready to believe you for reasons that are waiting to believe you, for reasons that don't entirely center on the argument you're presenting, but something that existed before, that have faith and believe that you will deliver them something, even the impossible. And I question whether or not this, and I love the way you said it, that this move to sell on liberal grievance has the same reservoir of faith that the conservative grievance had before.
Tony, thank you. Evan, what do you think?
Well, we are, and I'm very conscious of this now, 10 years into the Trump era. And Susan is just one of our leading experts on what that means for our politics. So I'm very curious to hear how she'll think about this. But remember, 10 years ago, people gravitated to Trump because fundamentally they believed that he would, as the caller so rightly put it, he would deliver, that he would give them, he would crack open the door to the world that he came from, that he knows. And here we are 10 years later, and I don't think there are that many Americans who look out and say to themselves, I got exactly what it is that Trump was promising. And so and the reason why I mentioned Trump is, look, he's not on the ballot in 2026, but of course he is in so many ways, just off stage. He is what this is a backlash to. And so I'm curious, here we are 10 years in, how it lives in the public mind, call it the sort of the prospect of Trump opening up the ranks of the elites. Does that still have any traction? Does it have, to use the caller's word, does it have a reservoir of power? And Susan, I'm curious what you make of that.
It'll be interesting to see, Evan, when you look at the numbers, I think it's pretty clear that it is visceral rage and desire for Democrats to speak out more forcefully and to act more sort of decisively in standing up against Trump that is powering a large swath of the electorate this year. And that's not uncommon in a midterm election. Again and again, the president's party, Democrat or Republican, has lost seats 2 years after a presidential election. That's even more the case now because what we're seeing in the polls is amazing. It's not just Democrats who are fueled by an anti-Trump backlash. It's independents and even Republican-leaning independents who basically handed Donald Trump a second term in office, many of them specifically for the reason that he promised to crack inflation, that he promised to bring prices down on day one. And so I think that's why you're hearing Democrats, in different degrees, depending on the candidate, depending on the state, depending on the district. It's why you're hearing Democrats talk so much about affordability, about billionaires, about inequality. It's because the electorate that elected Donald Trump in 2024 was very focused on the economics. And that's the one clear-cut way in which, anyone reality-based can say Donald Trump did not deliver that, right? Donald Trump did not make the prices go down. In fact, he started a war in the middle of the election year and made the prices first for energy and then for everything else go way up. So I think that's at the heart of it. My view here in Washington is that we tend to overstate the role of ideology in politics, but understate the role of this kind of visceral, feeling. And the economics still powers our elections in so many ways.
Did you want to keep going on that, Evan?
Well, I just think Susan's exactly right. I think that, this is a case where people are voting in very proximate, visceral ways, meaning like when they get up and they go out and they try to pay for their kids' education, they try to pay for health care, they try to go to the grocery store. Do they feel that they're better off, right? I mean, isn't that the oldest line in politics? Are you better off today than you were a year ago? And there's not a lot of people who are saying, yes, I am. And I think, one of the things that's, by the way, magnificent about hearing these calls today is it really illuminates exactly the spectrum of debate that we're talking about, which is why this is the core issue going into this midterm. This is what we talk about on our show all the time, because it is not a fixed target. Trying to get a bead on where the American public is on questions like the American dream, you have to be paying close attention to what people are saying, and you have to try to accommodate all of these different ideas into I think a really live sense, because it is not static.
Yes, we traffic in the spectrum of calls. But Susan, as a follow-up to that, thinking about the last two calls, Tony characterizing grievance versus grievance, and Mariella talking about, the generational sort of economic depression. I mean, depression in an emotional sense, pessimism about being able to do better or even as well as your parents did. I mean, those two certainly connect, but I think it even connects with the much maligned Democratic Party autopsy report about why they lost the 2024 election, where I think one of the things that was in there, for the many things that weren't in there, was that they ran too much on being anti-Trump and not enough on what they're going to do for people. And I'm curious if you think, with all this economic unhappiness and pessimism and struggle, you're hearing that as opposed to millionaires and billionaires and corruption and the East Wing, and Trump puts his name on the Kennedy Center and the $250 bill, as opposed to real concrete alternatives that the Democrats are offering.
Yeah, I mean, that's the push and pull here. Again, my view is that inside the Beltway, Democrats tend to over-prioritize ideology. I'm very mindful. I think back to those Democratic primary debates in 2020 election when, basically they were so detached from the reality of politics and the reality of how close Trump was to getting a second term, Brian. Democrats spent week after week in those primary debates arguing with each other over fantasy healthcare plans that they would never have the ability to pass into law. And they didn't talk about, the political reality of the country as it existed at that time. And of course, we all know the story there. Joe Biden emerges as the winner in that because it was perceived that Democrats, were busy in sort of fantasy land technocratic policy debates. And, that was arguably won the 2020 election, but at a certain cost that we now see in Trump having won re-election. So, both parties have a problem with their own electorate, which is to say that the party as an institution has eroded along with all the other institutions in our society. People have lost faith in institutions and their leadership. And I think that's definitely the case for the institutional Democratic Party heading into this election. In fact, if you actually unpack the numbers of why it is people say they're dissatisfied with the Democratic Party, a very large chunk of that is because people feel that they're not opposing Trump strongly enough. So, there's a million different explanations, one of which is, well, gee, we need better healthcare policy proposals. But another of which is that I would really like people to stand up to Donald Trump and not recognizing that when you've lost the House and you've lost the Senate and you've lost the executive branch, it's very hard to find concrete ways of blockading Trump and his supporters from doing things that you don't support.
Right. Evan, I wonder how much you think Zohran Mamdani's, at least his campaign, it's a little early in his mayoralty, but maybe even that, serves as a model for Democrats for Congress to run in swing districts that, of course, are very much unlike New York City in many ways. But one of the things that he did was run on very concrete economic inequality or, toward more economic equality proposals. Every New Yorker who paid any attention to the news last year could say, freeze the rent, free buses, and universal childcare. And I wonder if you think, and I know you had a Mamdani strategist on your podcast, so is there a model there for Democrats who are running in places that are very much unlike New York City, demographically or in a historical sense politically?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, Brian. I mean, we had a guest on. Morris Katz is the campaign guru for Mamdani's campaign. He's 26 years old. Some listeners will have heard about him. But what's so interesting is, this was a campaign, as we all know, that kind of came out of nowhere. And what it did, as you described well, I think, is figured out these very concrete, very specific ways in which you could tap into this underlying sense of anxiety by giving people an idea of the concrete ways in which their life was frustrating and that you'd try to fix that for them. You know what? One of the things that Katz said to us is that A couple of things. Yeah, one, he said that people right now are really sick of the style of politicians. He has an idea that he says if you've wanted to be president of the United States since you were 5 years old, a lot of people think you're kind of a loser. Meaning that the whole sort of old-fashioned shtick around politics is really tired right now. And so that's why these outsider candidates have a strong shot. And you're seeing this in many places around the country. It's not just, Plattner, for example. But if you go into, there are at least half a dozen of these races in various places where you've got Democrats like, there's a smoke jumper in Montana, there's a retired firefighter in Pennsylvania, you've got an iron worker in Ohio, all of whom don't fit the classic style of a Democratic politician, but are borrowing a bit from the Mamdani playbook, and they are generating a lot of energy. It's not clear yet whether it works, but they're generating energy in these places where it is going to be very closely fought. So I think you're right to zero in on what we might call the kind of Mamdani aesthetic, the Mamdani style. It is clearly more powerful than just in New York City.
And we'll play a clip from one of your podcasts of another Democrat who might be put in that category, but you'll describe how you think he should be placed. Jason Crow from Colorado. As we continue with Evan Osnos and Susan Glasser from The New Yorker and from their Political Scene podcast that The New Yorker puts out, and your calls and texts in a minute, 212-433, WNYC, 212-433-9692. And Jason Crow will help us take the Trump corruption issue head on, and if it matters to the midterms, right after this. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we continue with Evan Osnos and Susan Glasser from The New Yorker and their Political Scene podcast, and your calls and texts, 212-433 WNYC. They're also going to do one of their podcast tapings live at the 92nd Street Y this week, along with their other co-host, Jane Mayer, 7:30 this Thursday night. 92Y sells tickets for in-person or streaming for those events. Susan, I see your 92nd Street Y event this Thursday is being advertised with this lead question. Are corruption and economic equality becoming the defining issues in American politics and the weapons that could drive a Democratic comeback in the 2026 midterms? So we've been talking about economic inequality. I'll bite on corruption, too. Do you want to scoop your event by starting to answer that part here?
Well, thank you, Brian. We're really looking forward to it. Evan and Jane and I have been doing this podcast for a few years now, and we always love the chance to actually do it in person. Somehow it feels like it all makes more sense, at least for a little while. These politics are crazy, and I personally have taken a huge, let's just say, it's a relief factor to every week at least be able to sit down and talk through it, because for 10 years at least it's felt pretty crazy. And I think, this question of the visceral anger in American politics, corruption drives a lot of it. It's one of the alarming signs of Democratic small d rollback in countries around the world. We all watched and did an episode that I really loved of our podcast about the recent fall of Viktor Orban in Hungary and what Democrats here in the U.S. might be able to learn from it. And I learned about the zebra factor. What happened in Hungary's election, which is really interesting after more than a decade of Orban's rule, a declining democracy in Hungary. There was a report that there were exotic animals, including zebras, running around an estate owned by Orban's father. It turned out to be the neighbors. The zebra became the symbol of the opposition. People were literally showing up at rallies for the opposition with stuffed zebra toy animals as a symbol of it. And, the question here is the symbol of this election is going to be Donald Trump and his ballroom, the Arc de Trump, the reflecting pool. There's so many to choose from. Evan mentioned the pardons that appear to be for sale. I mean, the enrichment to the tune of billions of dollars of the Trump family. That would have been an unbelievable scandal in any other administration. People talked about Hunter Biden. Add a whole bunch of zeros to get to anywhere near the level of payouts that you're seeing for the Trump family in this administration. So I think it's a big driver of politics this year. I do.
Yeah, the episode title that you had for that one was called Corruption Toppled Viktor Orban. Could Donald Trump be next? And here's a clip from, I'm not sure if it was that podcast or one of the others, but that I found very interesting in this respect. It's Democratic Congressman Jason Crow, who you call one of the seditious six, we'll ask what that term means, on how a perception of Trump as corrupt can be spun as more than something to tisk about, but is actually affecting regular voters.
And we should be willing to tackle corruption. You just have to do it the right way, right? Corruption isn't just about some abstract thing that's happening that's, over there or in D.C. Corruption, what it really is theft from my constituents. It's them stealing out of the pockets of Americans, right? So they can't afford health care. They can't afford their rent and mortgages. And the money that should be in their pockets to pay their mortgage and their rent and to buy their groceries is going to repaint the reflecting pool. It's going to the billion-dollar ballroom. It's going to buy a golf course at Andrews Air Force Base. I mean, that is absurd, and I'm never going to apologize for going after money and going after corruption that's stealing from my constituents.
Colorado Congressman Jason Crow on the New Yorker's Political Scene podcast, middle of last month. What's that reference, Evan, in your episode title there to Crow as one of the Democratic Party's seditious six?
Well, people might remember that there was a point earlier in this administration when Democratic members of Congress had recorded a video in which they reminded service members that they are not required to follow illegal orders. And Trump threatened to have them arrested. And, Crow is, let's just say, speaking with some credibility on military matters. I mean, he's an Army Ranger veteran. He's a member of the House Intelligence and Armed Services Committee. And I think what was so fascinating about what you heard in that clip a moment ago is that he's taking an issue which, let's face it, I don't care if you're a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, anything else. Nobody likes the idea of this hard-earned tax money that we pay in being frittered away, either in waste or fraud or abuse or in corruption. And so one of the messages that Crow is communicating inside the party and outside, but particularly to candidates in these really kind of purple swingy districts around the country, is make this local and concrete. Talk about the issues, the things that people are frustrated about. Why don't they have more funding for education? Why don't they have more funding for local infrastructure and roads and bridges? Well, the answer may be partly in the fact that you have a government in Washington led by Donald Trump that is currently using its money in all kinds of flamboyantly self-serving ways. That's a way of linking this kind of distant issue of corruption to something that feels really immediate and visceral in people's lives.
Edward in Union County. You're on WNYC. Hello, Edward.
Hey, how are you, Brian? I just want to set the context for my question. The effective and affective dissolution of the Voting Rights Act, the Doge government layoffs, and earlier the idea of the valor and the 47% of people that don't pay taxes was stated by Romney. So for me, and someone who, six-figure salary, some of my friends up in the middle six figures, right? We feel like there's a conversation happening, at least amongst people that I know, that this valor has creeped into this part of the I guess I want to say the business world, or people that have good jobs. And I am seeing, and friends of mine are seeing, that people are either being effectively laid off, or something is being said, hey, you did not perform this duty correctly or very well, so you are no longer a part of this organization. I'm just saying it could be a conspiracy, but I am saying that this is something that is actually happening, and this is something that people in my community, the Black community, African-American community, are saying, is this happening? That happened in government, it happened with Doge, it happened with the Voting Rights Act. Now is it happening to us collectively as a group because of this idea of valor? That's the only reason why I called, is because someone mentioned that is, something that's kind of creeping into people's collective idea about, hey, we should move forward with, cutting people's taxes or not, people not paying taxes. Therefore, what does that say about, the people that are paying taxes and the 1%
Right.
or higher.
So are you saying, Edward, in part that, excuse me, are you saying in part that you think some people you know who might even have been inclined to vote Republican in the past, based on having good incomes that they felt they wanted to protect, quote unquote, are now being turned in the other way because of the massive inequality and insecurity of their jobs?
That is certainly happening as well. Typically, some of the folks I know that were more inclined to a fiscal idea of republicanism are turning away because, it's happening to them, or I could say it's happening to us. And I don't know if I'm going to be next, but I'm certainly, the idea that people are being placed in a desperate situation because of folks' politics, even at that level of private sector jobs, that is starting to be a thing. I'm not sure if it is a thing. I know in some black media I've heard of it being a thing, of people losing their job and opportunities because, people have this idea that, if I can't follow the program with, Trump and MAGA in a way that's outward, at least I have this particular, it could be conspiracy, but I know I've seen it. I've been seeing more layoffs and more people being saying the idea that you are not doing your job, therefore you are no longer employed here.
Right. And I guess you're also referring to kind of using an excuse of somebody being, quote, a diversity hire, even if they were completely 100%. Qualified for their job at the same right. time that the Voting Rights Act is being dismantled and companies are getting sued by the administration if they do have diversity programs.
Yes. You've hit the nail on the head, and I didn't have that prepared for my question for the panel, but yes, you've hit the nail on the head. It's certainly something that, if you can't support in one way, if you can't support outwardly, folks are saying, well, maybe my boss is supporting in this way.
Yeah. Edward, I think you're a first-time caller. Call us again, okay? Thank you. Thank you very much. One more. Kylie in Northern Virginia as we go from New Jersey south for one more voice in this segment besides our guests. Hi, Kylie. You're on WNYC.
Hi, Brian. I'm from New Jersey, always from New Jersey. So even down here in these DMV streets, still repping New Jersey, which is why I've now apparently become a troll of Cory Booker's. But that's a whole other conversation. Yeah. Cory Booker puts everything on social media.
We'll have to get you back on one day to talk about that with another call. But go ahead.
Oh, yes, please. Yes, please. So here is my question it's a question and also like a little bit of a push. So what I would love to see from the media, particularly around this topic, is a little bit of education on how public goods help millionaires and billionaires become millionaires and billionaires. And so the infrastructure to do a lot of these businesses, particularly around tech, right? Those were public funds that laid the infrastructure for that. In the same way, I live in Northern Virginia now, these data centers, right, which are like make it possible for AI to exist. Mm-hmm. This is happening on the backs of taxpayers. So then you take these public goods, we're not even going to talk about education and roads and Medicaid that allow companies to not have to pay fair wages. Do you take all these public goods that make it possible for people to build these industries and businesses that make these billionaires, and then they want to say, oh, the government's overreaching by charging taxes? It's like this was an investment. These were public dollars that allowed this business to thrive. So this is not just about you paying your fair share. You took public goods that made your business thrive, which means you owe tax. You have to pay for that. And so the question is, am I overstating that? Because maybe I am. And if I'm not overstating that, then why isn't the media, particularly the media that's trying to get like the truth out, why are we saying that? You like giving people who want to have an argument against this kind of oligarchy situation, giving them some fire to say, that's your money, and let me show you where that came from. And so now this is kind of the base you get to have in your voice when you fight about what billionaires and millionaires should be doing to pay their fair share. So that's my question and a little push.
Thank you, Kylie. Really interesting. Susan, you want to react to those last two calls at all?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to thank Kyla. I think she's making a really important point. I would also put a shout out here because there's been some terrific and important investigative reporting done, not just by our colleagues at the New Yorker, but absolutely look at ProPublica, look at some of the Times investigative reporting. What you'll see is track the lobbying money. It's gone way up, and it's gone way up in particular by these tech giants. There's a reason that so many of them showed up in Washington for Donald Trump's inauguration, or they're paying money into the ballroom. It's not that Tim Cook overnight woke up, looked in the mirror and said, oh my God, I really want to wear a MAGA red hat and I love Donald Trump. There are some of these billionaires who I think maybe they did become personal converts to the cult of Trump. But in many cases, it's because these tech giants and other large companies are understanding it's an incredible investment. You could call it pay to play. Trump has been more nakedly in his administration embracing a form of pay to play than we've seen in recent decades, frankly. It's an incredible investment. You spend how much money lobbying? Let's say $10 million, $50 million. You're talking about potential tax breaks or other government infrastructure investment to the tune of billions of dollars. And so I actually think the caller is really onto something about the hidden costs. We tend to emphasize personal drama in how we think about politics, or we talked earlier in this radio show today, Brian, about the sort of vibe-based feeling of insecurity the previous caller talked about. I think that's all real and it powers things. But it's also true that this inequality is being fueled by actual policies of our government. And many of those tech giants have found out it's a lot easier to spend a few $1,000,000 in order to get potential payoffs of billions of dollars. And that's why they're in Washington, frankly.
Let me touch very briefly, and then we're out of time, on another thing that Kylie in her call referenced. She mentioned the data centers. And one of your other recent podcast discussions was subtitled How Anger Over Artificial Intelligence Might Drive the Next Wave of Populist Politics. And so we've been talking through this whole segment about populist politics from left and right over economic inequality. Since anger over AI, Evan, seems to run both left and right, how do you see the politics of it taking shape so far, and in the short term, how it might affect these midterm elections?
Well, you're absolutely right. It is one of the few issues that you can perhaps maybe the only issue, Brian, on which Steve Bannon and Bernie Sanders can break bread, which is they both feel as if there is a moment emerging right now in which the regulatory system around AI, the decisions that will be made about, for instance, who is going to pay for these huge investments, as Kylie described, that will go into the profits of AI companies, and who will get the profits from it? Where will the returns go? And what will the rules be around how much AI is going to disrupt the labor force? And are there going to be steps taken to prevent the disruptions in people's lives? All of these questions have sort of come at us almost overnight, like a tsunami, much faster than our political system can usually metabolize them. It's notable to me that just today, Bernie Sanders has an op-ed in the New York Times titled, "AI belongs to the people, not to billionaires." And I mention it because people may not agree with Bernie Sanders on much, but he is picking up on something, which is that is very much an issue that is going to be on the ballot. And I'll tell you, interestingly, I've done a lot of reporting over the years in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. They've predicted this. They knew this was coming, that eventually AI would become a centerpiece of American politics. And I think that moment has arrived. And right now, you see Democrats actually in the position of beginning to articulate a language, a vocabulary of vigilance around AI. It's not as clear on the right yet, beyond the sort of ranks of Steve Bannon and others in his midst, what it is that they want. But on the left, you're beginning to hear people say, hold on, let's make sure that the next generation of workers coming out of college have a pathway to be able to climb the ladder of American success. And AI is a big piece of that.
Evan Osnos and Susan Glasser, New Yorker staff writers and co-hosts of their Political Scene podcast, are going to do one of the podcast tapings live at the 92nd Street Y this week, along with their other co-host, Jane Mayer. And did I see that David Remnick your overlord, the editor-in-chief and the host of the New Yorker Radio Hour, is also going to be on that with you?
He will.
Special
He's
guest.
Our special guest this week.
7:30 Thursday night. 92Y sells tickets for in-person or live streaming. Susan Glasser, Evan Osnos, great conversation. Thanks for interacting with our listeners. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you so much, Brian.